This little lecture is about the 7th chapter in Sean Lowen's Introduction to Instructed Second Language Acquisition, and this chapter is about the acquisition of pronunciation. I'm Una Cunningham. Now, the chapter starts off with a little look at different aspects of what pronunciation, what do we actually mean by pronunciation? And, well, what he says really is that pronunciation concerns itself with the sounds of a language. And in the case of language teaching, then we're looking at the sounds of the target language primarily, although as we'll see in a moment, we might also be looking at the sounds of the learner's own language in comparison to the sounds of the target language. So two different kinds of sounds really. Segmental sounds, that's the single sounds that in English, for example, are often written with letters. Make a distinction though between sounds and letters, so that the two letters C and H make a single sound ch. The two letters S and H make a single sound sh, and E and A might make E in a word like here or ear. Okay, so segments then are the smallest sound units, and Lowen talks about phonemes. Now, some of you might be familiar with the concept of phonemes, others might not. A phoneme is really a sound that's used in a language to make a difference between words. So, for example, the English words sheep and ship are different words, and the only part that's different really is the vowel sound in the middle, E or I. Other languages will work differently. So for example, he gives the example of the Spanish two words, pero, P-E-R-O, and perro, P-E-R-R-O. One means but, the other means dog, different words altogether. But for English speakers, it's kind of hard to pick up on the difference between the two, what we think of as R sounds. One is just a flap, r, similar to the r in the Maori language, and the other is a r with a rolled, trilled R. And that makes a difference between words in Spanish, but not in English. So that's the kind of thing that can be difficult to pick up on when you learn a new language. And that's really what we mean by contrastive analysis, that we look at differences between the target language and the first language. And that allows us to predict what might be difficult for the learners. Now, it doesn't really work all that well, because some things are difficult for learners everywhere, such as the th sounds of English, which are just difficult sounds. English-speaking children learn them often quite late, and some accents of English don't have them at all, but they're difficult for learners from a wide range of languages. Other kinds of sounds then are suprasegmentals. And suprasegmental, that is really something that applies to something larger than a segment, such as syllables or words or phrases. Things like pitch, prosody or intonation, and stress. So, for example, a suprasegmental contrast that Lowen mentions is the difference between a declarative and interrogative intonation. So that if I say, well, the example he has is Austin likes to race, and you can turn that into a question such as Austin likes to race, which can be, and then you can express different kinds of emotion with the prosody or the intonation as well. Stress is also important. For example, you can have contrastive stress. I said ship, not sheep, where I have ship with extra stress. Or words can also have stress in the sense that one syllable of the word will have more emphasis, more power attached to it, be more prominent than the rest of the word. Something like in the word computer, I'm sitting in front of my computer, and the U syllable in the middle is the one that has the most stress. The example here given in Lowen is on page 116. He talks about record and record. Patrick is going to record a record, where these two words are quite similar, but they have different stress. And one's a verb and one's a noun, etc. So that's really what we mean by pronunciation, and for the learner, these things can be quite difficult to acquire for a number of reasons, but perhaps the biggest problem is this matter of contrastive analysis. If the target language works differently than your own language, then it can be different to hear things and difficult to produce them. And that's the first issue in pronunciation acquisition that Loewen takes up, the difference between perception and production. And really, generally speaking, learners can perceive, they can hear a difference before they can produce it themselves. And there are a number of theories here. Jenkins, for example, and Saito quoted here that perception precedes production, that you have to be able to hear a difference before you can learn to make it yourself. And that seems fairly logical. And so then the question is it enough perhaps to teach learners to hear a difference and then hope that they're going to be able to produce the difference themselves? Some research, as Loewen says, proposes that second language production problems may come from problems with perception, so that really it's perception that you want to be teaching. So you want to teach learners to hear the difference between two sounds, and that will in itself automatically, as it were, help their production. He talks about the goals of pronunciation learning, and this is something that I found particularly interesting, and I've actually written a paper about that, which I'll put into the Learn site for you to have a look at if you like, about models and targets. So what is actually the target of pronunciation learning? Now, especially in the case of English as a foreign language all over the world, people generally want to sound like a native speaker. Obviously, native speakers have a great situation in the English-speaking world, and it's kind of a logical target for learners to want to sound native-like. Unfortunately, it's really, really difficult to learn a foreign language well enough to be able to sound like a native speaker, and most people never get to that stage. Now, if we think instead of English, if we think about foreign languages that are taught in New Zealand, for example, French or Japanese, really it's not a reasonable target for us to have to make our learners native-like, because they don't get enough input. Now, the case for English as a second language is different, because there, particularly with young learners, there is perhaps both an ambition and a reasonable expectation that the learner will become very, very good indeed at English and actually be able to speak English with a native-like accent in many cases, not in all cases. So some research here, there's this two principles that have driven this kind of research in second language pronunciation. The idea on the one hand that nativeness or native-likeness is the target, that you shouldn't be able to hear the difference between the learner and a native speaker or a monolingual speaker. And the other idea is intelligibility, that the speaker should be able to make themselves understood. And then, well, there's been a lot of research into this, and people are thinking, well, understood to whom? Is it enough to be understood to speakers of your own language, or do you have to be understood by speakers of the target language? So that's a bit of an issue, particularly in the case of languages that are used for international communication. Languages such as English, perhaps Spanish, perhaps French, that are used widely by people who don't speak the language as a first language. So, yeah, that's the idea of intelligibility is quite poisonous, I would say, almost. But a lot of modern thinking in foreign language teaching is that intelligibility is a reasonable target, that you should be able to make yourself understood in the target language, that you should be able to, it's okay to sound like a speaker of your own language, but you should be able to communicate clearly enough in spoken language that people who are listening to you, regardless of what first language they have, should be able to understand what you're saying easily. Another aspect of this, which is quite related, is the idea of age. Now it's often said that young learners find it a lot easier to learn to speak a target language with no foreign accent, but in fact a lot of young learners do actually end up with something of an accent, and there are a few people who can actually start to learn a language when they're fully adult and not have a foreign accent. So there's quite a bit of individual variation. It does depend how much input you get. So even if, for example, you start speaking or learning French, let's say in New Zealand when you're very young, you probably won't end up sounding native-like simply because you won't get enough French. In the case of children who grow up in a situation where they're exposed to two languages quite extensively, either because their parents speak different languages or because their parents speak a language other than the language of society, then they really do get enough of both languages and can develop native-like pronunciation in more than one language, in the best case, but not always. Aptitude's another interesting fact here. There's the idea of some people have an ear for languages and can actually come further in their nativeness than others, and indeed in intelligibility. So, and the idea of calling it an ear for language rather than a tongue for language is interesting, going back to the idea that perception in fact might be more important than production here, that being able to hear the sounds accurately is perhaps a prerequisite for being able to pronounce them accurately. Before we move on to explicit and implicit pronunciation knowledge, let's just talk a little bit about identity. I spent 30 years in Sweden as a non-native speaker of Swedish, and I speak really good Swedish, but I actually have an immediately identifiable accent. So as soon as I open my mouth, people can hear that I'm not Swedish. They might not be really sure where I'm from, but they can hear I'm not Swedish. And really, I think part of the reason why, I could give you lessons about what's wrong with my accent. So it's not only a matter of perception either. I think I can clearly hear the difference between sounds that I don't actually distinguish between. But my accent is, to a certain extent, part of who I am. And that's something I think that we have to respect in the case of second language speakers. People who are living in a situation where they're not speaking their first language. Here we have perhaps the difference between assimilation and integration. That if you can speak the target language clearly enough, then maybe you don't need or want to pass for a native speaker. It's also a bit dangerous. If I was to pass for a native speaker of Swedish, I came to Sweden when I was 20 years old. So if I sounded like a native speaker, then people would expect me to know about all the kinds of things that happened during the first 20 years of my life in Sweden. And I wasn't there. I don't know that. I know about things that happened in other places. So identity can also be a factor here. Moving on then to explicit and implicit pronunciation knowledge. Well, getting back to these terms again, like we've been talking about all throughout this book. Explicit knowledge and implicit knowledge. So what does it mean to have explicit knowledge of pronunciation? Well, that would really be phonetics. So having studied phonetics, I can tell you about that a p sound is a voiceless bilabial stop. That because it's voiceless, in the word pronunciation, the following R becomes devoiced. I can tell you that in my pronunciation the R is slightly retroflex, and so forth. I can give you a lot of technical information about it, that explicit knowledge. The question is really, how much do learners actually need to know of that? So you can think that native speakers know very little explicit knowledge about their own pronunciation, just as they know very little explicit knowledge about their own grammar. Having said that, I can give you the example of when I was learning Spanish as a teenager at school. I had great difficulty with the two R sounds I mentioned previously, the pero and perro. But when I came to university, I started studying Spanish at university, and I had a Spanish phonetics lesson, and then I was presented with a whole list of all the phonemes of Spanish, and the difference between the flap, the r, and the rolled r, the trilled r, the r, was taught explicitly, and I got that explicit knowledge, and that for me was a huge eye-opener, that suddenly, oh, is that what I'm supposed to be doing? Okay, then I know, then I can have a go. Now, Loewen talks about, or he quotes Saito actually, Saito's 2013 B paper. No, actually it's just before that, saying that on page 120 that learners' articulatory muscles are trained in the L1 patterns, and that it can be difficult for adult L2 learners to retrain their muscles. Well, I'm not sure how difficult it is really. Things like trilling R's, I think once you actually realise what you're trying to do, and there perhaps some explicit knowledge would help, then you can have a go. What I don't believe is that people have that their tongues haven't grown properly or something. That I think is something that people often tell themselves. I think you're not accustomed to using those muscles, but you have those muscles. They haven't withered totally. I think it's just a matter of realising what you're trying to do, and practicing. So Loewen goes on towards the end of page 120, says that, as been stated in reference to other aspects of language, instruction can help in the development of explicit knowledge. That you can actually learn about the target language sounds. But I think some things are quite difficult to learn explicitly, and you actually might need to develop implicit knowledge. And there, I think things like intonation is one such thing. That is, there are systems, there are patterns, there are rules even about intonation contours, but it's a very complex system. And I think it's a lot easier just to pick up the intonation patterns and model on somebody else's pronunciation, for example. Okay, moving then to the actual teaching of pronunciation, instruction and pronunciation acquisition. Loewen said, well, it's the same as in any other part of this book. There's no, what he says, that there's no real research that he's found in instructed second language acquisition on implicit or incidental acquisition of pronunciation. That's really when people just pick up the pronunciation from using the language. So he's going to look at focus on form, and there's a couple of articles there as well that he quotes later on in the chapter, and I've put those into the Learn site for you to have a look at if you like, the links. Otherwise you can easily find these things yourself from the bibliography at the back of the text, and just put the titles into the library box at the side of the Learn room. But in focus on form here, what he says is focus on form can draw attention to second language phonology, the way that the language works. And he says that, well, you might actually have communication breakdown because of phonological errors in pronunciation, that is. And so you can actually, in meaning-focused interaction, it might be suitable to do some kind of recast, so that if a learner makes a pronunciation error, you simply find occasion to use that word yourself. I'm sure those of you working in early childhood do this all the time without even thinking about it. Like for example, if a learner says, "Oh, that's my shoe," and you say, "Yes, it's your shoe, isn't it? It's great, lovely red shoe," or whatever. So you actually don't need to correct it. explicitly, but you're just in recasting, you're giving implicit feedback. Loewen goes on to explicit instruction, when you actually have phonetic teaching as part of the lesson form. Now that's used variously in different countries, how much phonetics students learn. Saito talks that in the past 20 years pronunciation teaching has been largely explicit and decontextualized from meaning-focused contexts. Things like phonetic transcriptions, minimal pairs, that's words like sheep and ship that are almost the same, just to focus on the distinction, imitation of appropriate models. And I'm going to put up another little PowerPoint in the Learn site so that you can see the use of communicative ways of teaching pronunciation. This is one of the central aspects of pronunciation instruction has been the explicit teaching of the phonetic properties of the second language. Now, at what stage do we think that's appropriate? Well, certainly not for very young children. Perhaps it should be there at university level, but the levels in between, I think it does depend a lot on the learners and how interested they are in this kind of knowledge. It talks as well about repetition, this choral repetition, say after me, when the teacher actually tries to make the learners aware of the pronunciation. And of course, well, it depends how much you do it. I mean, the learners do need to have some input to be able to know how things are pronounced, but perhaps they're not really helped by saying a word lots and lots of times after a model. I don't know. There's not a lot of research on that. The third category here that Loewen takes up is technology, and I've also got an article or two in the Learn site there about that. What he says, technology has been used in a number of ways for pronunciation and learning, and one of the great hopes that people actually had of computer-assisted language learning was that there would be some kind of automatic speech recognition that could give learners feedback on the pronunciation. Unfortunately, that hasn't really worked terribly well. Other things that technology can help with are, for example, allowing the learner, just like the old-fashioned language labs that some of you remember, when you hear a phrase and then you're supposed to say after, and record your own voice and listen again and try and get closer and closer. Or you can also get some kind of visual feedback with a computer. But perhaps one of the main advantages of technology is that it allows the learner to listen to qualitative input, so they can get some real native speaker voices there, or advanced non-native models, so that they can actually hear a lot of the target language. Both intensive listening, where perhaps they're noticing, their attention's being brought to something, but also extensive listening. There's quite a lot going on there, but I think it's been a disappointment to a lot of people. Okay, that's all for now, and I hope that helped your reading, and hope you enjoy the other readings. Bye for now.